So good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for making time to join us on this panel discussion today. I am also trying to see if Chirag is here from Rolly Books. He had promised to be here, but I don't see him. We can bring him in when he gets here. Um, but I remember Rashmi speaking to us at our urban workshop series many years ago in CPR when she was in the thick of this research. And so it was really exciting for us when Rolly Books approached us and asked us if we'd want to do something around it. And a lot of the themes in Metronama actually resonate with work that CPR does, whether it's in the space of air pollution, whether it's in the space of transport, or in the space of informality in Delhi, housing informality in Delhi broadly. And it seemed like a good opportunity to connect many dots together. So a warm welcome to Rashmi Sadana, who's the author of the book we're discussing today, and all the wonderful panelists here, Rohit, Negi, Kalpana, Viswanath, Sarika, Panda, Bhatt, and Himanshu, Burte. I will paste short bios of our panelists as we go along, but you've already got that information in the invitation. So you know that they all are academics and practitioners who think deeply about cities, but from very different perspectives. So I'm looking forward to a very exciting panel. Infrastructure is not something that I think very deeply about as the central sort of theme of my work. But I think all of us are habituated to have drawing room discussions about infrastructure. We are always joking about how our cities are construction sites, how the roads are dug, how there's optical fiber line digging now, and now these recent more jazzy additions of metro rails and even bullet trains are being spoken about. So infrastructure is seen as good business, it's seen as good politics, and good infrastructure seems to overall be welcomed. But it's also deeply contested, and we know that we've all engaged in these conversations about contestations. Is it good for the environment? Is it good for public health? Is it actually improving quality of life? Is it enabling women to travel safely? Is it a public good? Does it serve only a few people? And so sort of these questions have animated not just scholarly discussions, but I think public debate for a very long time. And those of us who live in Delhi or who have studied Delhi are particularly, I think, exposed to debates about whether the BRT is good or not, whether the metro is good or not, whether so many flyovers being constructed before the Commonwealth Games actually did something good for the city, and so on and so forth. So Rashmi's book, I think Metronama, Scenes from the Delhi Metro, delves into many of these complexities. And so we're really happy that she's here. I was hoping that Chirag would be here to say something about Rolly, but we'll get to it when he joins in the meeting. So I'll start really, I think today with Rashmi. The format today is going to be just me throwing some questions out for the first round, and then a second round in which we can have a more common question that everyone can respond to. For the audience, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. We'll weave it into the discussion if it's possible and we have time, though I very much doubt, since everyone here, I'm sure, will have lots to say. Then we'll try and get you to ask your questions yourself. So I'm curious, Rashmi, how did you move from academic work around this subject to writing a book in this format? What provoked that shift? And I mean, what compelled you to tell the stories in the way that you told the stories? For those of you who haven't read the book, the book is sort of told in small vignettes, and it's designed in a way, but it's also a story, or it's also a vignette. So it's a very interesting sort of format and very readable format for a book. So that was my first sort of curiosity, and I think it'll sort of give everyone here who hasn't had a chance to read the book a sense of the thinking behind it. Rashmi, over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Mukta. And also, I just want to thank CPR for hosting this panel. Over the many years that I've been doing research in Delhi, really over 20 years, CPR is a place not only where I've gotten to present my work, but where I've attended so many thought-provoking panels and events. And so I really feel like it's part of my own Delhi landscape. So this book was based on just over 10 years of research. I did pretty typical ethnographic research. I'm an anthropologist. But written as a the time I started to write the book, over 10 years had passed, as I mentioned, and I basically had chronicled the first 3 phases of the metro, and I'm talking about the main construction phases. And I did that. I sort of kept doing the research. I didn't just research for a year or two, because I saw that with each new phase, sometimes with each line, sometimes with each new set of stations, the city was changing, and people's itineraries were changing, and people's idea of the city was changing as the borders sort of went out as well. And so this was a long durée project. And when I sat down to write it, I had my reams of field notes and photographs and all that kind of thing, and sound recordings and video clips. And I found myself writing in scenes. I found myself, looking at field notes, looking at bits of conversation, looking at descriptions of what people were wearing. And I immediately was taken back to that interaction, to that feeling I had with that person, whether it was talking to somebody at the DMRC in an office, or more often on, the Blue Line or wherever I was. And so I decided to go with that. I wrote at the beginning probably 5 or 10 scenes. I showed it to people just to get reactions. And then I wrote more and more. And of course, the academic in me thought, okay, where am I going to weave in my arguments and all of that? And I thought, okay, maybe I'll just have a big intro that does all of that. But the more I wrote, the more I saw that I was actually going to interweave my arguments and ideas into the scenes. And I would say it came a little bit naturally, in that I think that's just how I write. But it also came because I revised and rewrote each scene many times. So I really was getting into the granular of my own sort of scene that I had. And then slowly over time, they connected to one another in different ways. And then, of course, I arranged them in 3 different parts. So I would say that the form came through the nature of the object I was studying, of the own research trajectory. And the scenes, as you mentioned, they do reflect the stops and starts of the metro. That was something I sort of figured out at the very end. But of course, that idea was there in different ways all along.
Thanks, Rashmi. And why Delhi? I mean, would this book have been possible in another city? What's the link there? If you could just tell us a little bit on that.
Why Delhi is because, for several reasons. One, it's a city I feel very close to. I grew up in Los Angeles, California, but my parents are both from Delhi. And they started bringing me here when I was just before I was 2 years old. And I've been coming over my whole life. And so I've seen the city change, but I've also taken part in the transport landscape of the city for many years, in all of its different forms. And so Delhi has been a city that that I consider a second home, that has been stimulating to me at a personal level. In terms of my academic interests, when I was in graduate school, I had an interest in urbanism. I've always, I'm from a big city. I'm from LA. I, am partly, from or connected to Delhi. I've traveled. I've had the opportunity to travel in a lot of cities and go on metros and in a bunch of cities, from Hong Kong to London to New York. But in terms of what you read about cities, urban theory and urban stories, and even novels, the cities that I always would hear about would be the industrial cities of the West, the modern cities. So to understand David Harvey's Marxism, you get to know Paris very well. You read a lot about London, you read a lot about New York. And, after a while, I just thought, well, how can all of our urban theory be coming from these three cities and maybe a handful more, Chicago or even LA? And I started looking into the literature on Delhi, and I thought nobody is writing about, of course, people were writing about Delhi, but it was few and far between. It wasn't enough, in my view. Delhi, like many Indian cities, like many cities across, the global South, are, in my mind, the most interesting and fascinating cities in the world. And so I set out in my career actually to write about Delhi. And so my first book was also based in Delhi, about language politics and the literary field of Hindi and English. And with the second project on the metro, the first time I rode the metro, because I was so familiar with the city and the transport landscape, I knew, like everybody else taking those joy rides early on, I knew this was going to be a game changer. I wasn't convinced it was the best thing, fiscally speaking, in terms of who would benefit the most. And, we can get into that. But I knew that it was going to transform people's lives. And that was exciting to me. So to answer your question about, could I write about, of course, people have and people can write about metros in many other cities. Some people have said, oh, are you going to write about the DC metro next? And no, not at all. My interest was the metro, but the metro in Delhi. That's what was fascinating to me. And the interface between this shiny, globalized object of the metro and the city, the metro and the street, the metro and its people, the metro and the urban discourse of Delhi.
Thanks, Rashmi. I'll pivot to Kalpana next. And Kalpana, you work on issues of gender inclusion, and Delhi has a dubious reputation in that particular space. And we've discussed ad nauseum why, whenever we talk about women's gender violence, gender-based violence, or lack of safety, there is always sort of a finger pointing to Delhi, whether visible or invisible. What does the metro do to that conversation, or an infrastructure like the metro? Rashmi's book also has many vignettes about how young women are now leveraging the metro to do things that they were less confident about doing before. But since you look at many different types of infrastructures, not just the metro, you look at dark spots, you look at many other aspects of public space and safety. So how does infrastructure actually rewrite the possibilities for women in cities like Delhi?
Thanks, Mukta. Thanks to CPR for having me as part of this. Firstly, Rashmi, I really enjoyed the book, so I just do want to share that. I am actually a social anthropologist myself who decided not to stay in academics at all. And though I do a lot of writing, but it's not really within academics. So I really enjoyed the book because actually through the stories, you actually were saying a lot more in terms of the theory. So rather than having a chapter right up front, which was placing your theory and then having the vignettes as the ethnography, to me would have been less powerful than what you actually did. And so I really enjoyed that. I think if I look at, and I don't want to just focus on, safety and violence when I talk about gender, because I think I do believe that even in a city like Delhi, we need to move beyond such binaries and sort of a mechanistic understanding of how people engage with the city, with its infrastructure and with its spaces. There is enough about how Delhi is very unsafe. Having said that, many of us have spent many, many years of our lives in the city and done many things, which maybe when we count them, they seem like foolhardy and dangerous, but actually it's a city which actually allows you to do a lot as well. I think on the issue of on what is the metro as an infrastructure, or say the bus. For example, in Delhi now, we have recently introduced this free bus service for women, the pink ticket. Or there are places like which are women-only spaces. It could be a park. There are a couple of parks in Delhi. There's some Japanese park in West Delhi. There's the Sadana Park in Shahjahanabad and others, which are women-only spaces. And then there is the metro, which is the quintessential women-only space of Delhi, in a sense, you know. And what I feel is that the conversations that you brought out sort of, to me, represent the way that women negotiate their landscape. I mean, at one level, we can easily say women in Delhi do not have the right to the city. And we would be correct, in a sense. But that would be missing the lived realities of women in the city, which is to actually negotiate that on an everyday basis. And, you know, I think, you know, for example, I like that the idea where you asked them about the metro. You asked a group of people, is it exogenous or endogenous to the city? And they said it's spontaneous. And I think it's an interesting way of looking at it, because there is a criticism of metro. All of us who work in transport, there is the argument, why not the bus? Why not the BRT? This is way too much money. But I know as a woman, I really love the metro. I mean, the metro has, even for someone like me, given me a freedom, you know. And so there is a sort of a dichotomy in that, you know. In my theoretical work, I will say women don't have a right to the city, the metro may not be been the best way to say, but I do know that the metro has changed the lives of women in this city, and not just people like us. And that's what comes out in your book, whether it's, you know, that college lecturer who was married and used to move around in the car. And after her divorce, she didn't have a car. And, you know, she actually takes the metro to the court. And then that perspective of the city from the metro. I also like the fact that the metro is both underground and on top. Because unlike Paris and New York and this thing, where you don't engage with the city when you're in the metro. Whereas in Delhi, you do in so many ways. You suddenly come out and you see the Qutub Minar. I must say, every time it still fascinates me, you know. And so I think that, or that big, whatever, that Hanuman in West Delhi, Pitampura, you know, it sort of hits you in the face. So, you know, and the young college women interacting, and how, for example, sitting on the ground. I mean, like, you know, it's such a funny thing. I mean, in trains, you talk about how the metro is so different from a train, but there are a lot of behaviors on the train that have been carried over to the metro. So a lot of people sit on the floor, though they are told, often they don't and all that. But at the end of the day, even the metro guards let you do it, because they see how tired you are and how heavy your bag is. And they let these young women, students, or even working women sit on the floor. So I think, you know, I think the way we look at infrastructure, if we look at it with a sort of a perspective of an understanding of what goes behind this thing, but behind the theory of it, so whether it's the metro or why the BRT didn't succeed in Delhi, but the ethnography of it, which is actually the lived experiences of women in the city, including the sexual harassment. And I found that very interesting. That's actually very true. One woman said she was, someone grabbed her when she was in the metro, and then she just went ahead. And it was like this thing of, you endure all this. And this is the truth of all of us women who live in cities. We, you know, there are stories of how it can be so terrible and it restricts your lives. But we also know that all of us have gone through it. We've all ridden buses. We've all, you know, some of us have also carried safety pins before the safety pin was the app. I know in Chennai, we used to carry safety pins. We used to use all kinds of methods of trying to create space for ourselves in the public transport. And I think in that sense, you know, I think just for my first intervention, I think this kind of a sense that, you know, as women, as younger women, as older women, you're constantly negotiating. And I think, when women tell us that they don't tell their families about sexual harassment that takes place because it'll restrict them, it is a negotiation. And that agency in that negotiation is something we need to, I think, unpack. It's very easy to say, oh, this is patriarchy and women don't tell their families and this is terrible and this is not work. But I think, at least for me personally, after working in so many years, I think somewhere we have to recognize the grays. We have to begin to explore those gray parts of where we live in cities. I've lived in several big cities in my life. And I like the idea that, of course, we all love New York and Paris, but I do actually love Delhi. Strange. I mean, I would say that I do. I think that despite everything, there is something about the city. And I've lived in Bombay, and I loved Bombay then. I still say it probably offers more freedom than Delhi does in some ways. But I read half your book on a metro. I don't ride the metro very much these days because of COVID and all kinds of stuff. We were not really moving out, but we started moving out again. And I was taking that airport line. It's a quick ride, so I had 15 minutes one way, 15 minutes back. I was reading it, and it sort of felt very correct to actually do quite a bit of the reading of that book in the metro. Actually, before that, I don't think I've gone into the metro since March 2020 when COVID struck. So, it's also a sense of freedom of being able to be out. And, I know for my daughter, it was the first time, because we live in Gurgaon. And, the sort of, I don't want to say anything more about that. As urbanists, we all have enough to say about Gurgaon. But, I was like, go to the city, and go and see what a city is, take the metro and go. I tell my kids that, that is the city. This is not really a city. This is a comfortable life that we've provided you. But really, if you want to see a city, go to Delhi. And I think the metro gives you that, with all its criticism, I think the interstices and those spaces of, the conversation and other stuff maybe in the second round I'll speak about, but I think really in terms of understanding that women's lives are complex, and it cannot be boiled down to fear and violence and restrictions, because I think in that each one of us is negotiating. And I think the book to me brings out that negotiation and agency. Thanks.
Thanks, Kalpana. I'll actually bring Rohit in here. And Rohit, I had two very different questions for you, but I'll lay both of them out. Just picking up on, where Kalpana left off. I mean, you teach in a university. It's a state university. It's split across multiple campuses in Delhi, which are themselves perhaps best connected by the metro. The two COVID years and online education, which I'm sure we're all still traumatized by, barring those, your students and your university life is also so intrinsically linked with the metro. So this kind of things that Kalpana is saying is something that you must be finding teaching in urban studies, a global studies program in a city like Delhi, to students who are largely from Delhi, from diverse backgrounds, many of them from very modest backgrounds. So I'd like you to say something a little bit on that bit. And of course, the other question on your own work on urban ecology. And, I was really thinking, one of the quandaries of trying to raise awareness on ecological issues is that the negative impacts are not really visible even to those who are hugely affected by the problems. So, how do we even have these conversations when, we have this jazzy infrastructure and a very positivist debate around infrastructure? So there's two very different buckets, but I thought maybe you can speak a little to both before we move to Sarika and Himanshu.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mukta. And I'll try to do justice to your questions. But before that, congratulations to Dr. Sadana for the book. I completely second what Kalpana was saying in terms of it being so readable. So, in fact, lovingly composed even, right? You can see the investment of the author in not only the writing, but also in the city, right? That sort of comes through. And as you say somewhere in the book that metro isn't just an artifact in and of the city, but it really is also a process that produces the city alongside, right? and sort of being an urban geographer at heart, I mean, that is something that sort of I'm constantly sort of fascinated by. But yeah, but to the issue of the university, absolutely, you're absolutely right. All our three campuses are close to different metro lines, the yellow, the red, and one where I am mostly teaching in, which is in West Delhi, in Karampura area. We have like three different lines going around us, and we're sort of right at the middle of that, equidistant from all of these. And it is also correct, like students mostly take the metro. But interestingly, one of our students, she did a dissertation a couple of years back on the Grameen Seva, which is this sort of para-transit mode, which basically the goal was to connect hinterland villages and peripheral settlements to the center of the city. And I was struck by how like she came from one of these areas and would travel to Karampura every day on this Grameen Seva. And her perspective was so wonderful and so rich, because she always talked about it not just as a policy, not just in terms of the policy, not just in terms of the physical aspect of the transportation, but also as a place where socialities emerge, right? Where a lot of times women who take these Grameen Seva, because they're also quite flexible, by the way, where if you want to go someplace, and even if it's not on the route, the driver, if you know the person, and people build these relationships with the helpers and drivers, they will take you right to your doorstep. If you don't have money that day to pay 10 rupees or 15 rupees, they'll say, okay, 5 rupees de do aaj, koi baat nahi. So, these kinds of things that also become part of everyday experience of transportation are very much lived in Delhi. And then you have the metro, which imagines citizenry and people in a very different manner. I think that's also one part of the book, which there's a lot of detail about, right? So how metro produces citizens. But the other thing I wanted to do is partly environmental, but also partly look at one critique that a colleague of ours, Pritpal, he actually wrote a critical piece on the metro about 10 years ago. And I was rereading it after reading this book. And he said that basically it was a very critical piece, and it said that the metro hadn't lessened congestion, nor it had lessened pollution. And he also said that there has been this perverse valuing of land and gentrification of neighborhoods as a result of the metro. And certainly even today, given its steep cost, and the cost price has increased tremendously in the last few years, as well as stagnant ridership to some extent. In fact, last year there was the CAG revealed that the metro had overestimated ridership by 50% in the previous years. It is unclear in purely technical terms if the metro can be hailed as an unmitigated success. But as the book suggests, and as Kalpana also mentioned here, this kind of analysis is at best partial. One has to, I think we need to step back a little bit into the 1990s to also try to make sense environmentally and infrastructurally of this intervention, right? So what was going on in the 1990s? So you had this few years of liberalization, privatization, there was more investment that was coming in. The question really was, how does Delhi compete with other cities to attract capital? What are to be the spatial imprints of these strategies? And as property becomes highly valued, new urban imaginaries also begin to take shape at that point of time. And there has been enough work now looking at this whole world-class discourse and so on that was we were living in back then. Then there is the infrastructural reality. So I'm talking about three realities: the neoliberal reality, second, the infrastructural reality, which is really the jarring feeling when confronted with these visions of world-classness and the actually existing infrastructures. So there are back then DTC buses and private buses. If you remember, there was this infamous red line, which was colored blue at some point. It had a makeover, and now we had blue line. As students used to travel the city with 12 rupee bus passes for a month, and we could take any route. And in fact, mine is that perhaps that generation which is neither pre-metro nor post-metro. We were commuting on a daily basis while the metro was being built. So really, the worst of the worst of all, struggling with heat and dust at Ames intersection every day. And then there was all these other modes of transport, which seemed to be quite incongruous with this post-industrial world-class city kind of vision, right? And third is the environmental reality. By the 1990s, mid-90s, late 90s, it was very clear that things were getting really bad. And the Center for Science and Environment and other organizations had already mounted campaigns and brought this issue to the public discourse, right? And certainly people were feeling it also on a daily basis. So the air also did not seem to cooperate with this post-industrial world-classness that we imagined, that we wanted. And so I think that part of the discursive power of the metro and that has remained since then is that it cuts through these three things. It sort of seems to be an answer to all these three. It kind of articulates big concerns in front of the city and says, here is a solution that is environmental, infrastructurally world class, and then it is that kind of post-industrial movement of people from one part of the city, service industry workers can move around and so on. So which is why I think the cost benefit analysis never had a chance in front of the metro. There was so much more that was being promised, and which simple sort of calculations, for instance, BRTS, which is discussed in the book, it doesn't stand a chance in front of the kind of promise that the metro held. Now, specifically for air pollution, which has been something that I've been looking at, it's not just the metro, it's become a central element to larger urban policy and politics, to the extent that there has been an entire, what you can call an infrastructuring of Delhi, and to some extent, smaller extent, the NCR for cleaner air. Metro is a big part of that, but so are CNG, LPG, expansion of monitoring, cleaner fuels, emission standards, and all the way to the recent smog towers, which of course that's another story altogether. But the point is that there are all kinds of interventions around this. And despite all of this, Delhi even today gets only about 50 days in a year of air that conforms to even the Indian standards. And then there is the seasonal smog during the onset of winter, when the attention really spikes. So the metro's argument is that things would be even worse without it. And really, there's no way to really counter that, because yes, of course. In fact, the outgoing MD of the metro recently said as much when he criticized environmental activists who were opposed to the felling of trees for the construction of metro. And because the metro framing, and I believe other panelists may talk more about it, the metro framing leaves little space for other conversations around public transport. BRT is discussed, like I said, in this book, but also potentially at-grade rail, trams, all kinds of different options that might be otherwise in the discussion, but now we sort of immediately zoom into a metro. So for all of these reasons, I'm actually quite ambivalent about metro from an environmental lens, though I understand its appeal at the discursive and also many other levels, personal experiences and everyday experiences and so on. And I have actually tried to scratch further to see if there's something more to say here, but really I think on reflection that this kind of ambivalence of infrastructure is really the note I would like to end with. So let me just stop there at the moment.
Thanks, Rohit. Actually, that's a great segue into what I wanted to ask Sarika. So Sarika, again, like two questions. One more obvious question, which Rohit has already led you to, saying, there is, it's not just the Delhi metro, now it's city after city after city, and the main policy, transportation policy of the government of India in terms of how it supports cities for transportation seems to be sort of, hinging around the metro. And I know that transport folks have been really trying to push that needle in and trying to see what else can be done. So of course, that I would like you to express your views on. But I wanted you to actually pivot away from the metro to the other area of your work, which has fascinated me eternally, which is your road safety work. And there you're looking at roads as infrastructure. Now that's an older form of infrastructure, much more familiar, much less jazzy form of infrastructure, where you are, from what I understand, looking at how design and management of infrastructure can actually, lead to better outcomes. So it's a road is a road is a road, but no, there's actually a lot you can do with the road to make it better. So I just wanted to also, I mean, other than the metro discussion and how the metro is located within the larger transportation discourse, there's also a lot about the design and management of transportation infrastructure that perhaps we're not paying enough attention to. And I know Himanshu can say more on that in a bit, but Sarika, over to you.
Thank you, Mukta. I think Rohit fixed the agenda for me, actually. I will answer the second question first. What is the agenda of building this kind of transportation system in India? It is basically to move people, right? So we need to understand, or we need to look into the data, existing data of Delhi. What is the percentage of people using metro, and why there is a gap between, as I said, 30% of the people use buses in Delhi and 3% of people use metro in Delhi. Why? Because buses are in your doorstep. It is not people like us who is using metro. Even the mass, if it is mass versus class, even the mass cannot afford metro, right? If we are developing for the people. So if I say that only 3% people using metro, so that is the big question again. Either it is Delhi or the white elephants in Jaipur, Kochi, which is running as a toy trains, as a tourism attraction in all these cities like Lucknow and other cities, which got really fascinated from Delhi. And we are very good in copying and pasting from various parts of the world. But of course, I can say that Delhi metro become lifeline. But is it actual data? Is it catering to so many social, economic development of the city? Or is there other mode of transport which is addressing actually this issue? For example, Rohit mentioned about this paratransit, this Bhatt or this whole informal public transport. They even cater more passenger than metro in Delhi. And then comes the walking. That is the biggest question mark. Why there is less passenger in metro? One is carrying capacity, of course. After having so many kilometers of metro and connecting to the whole suburbs of Delhi, still we have 3% people using metro. The biggest problem is you cannot walk to metro station. Even if I go to metro station and take a metro from Gurgaon to Delhi, I have to book a cab, or somebody from a driver or my husband or anyone drop me to the metro station to take a metro to go to Delhi. So there is a big gap on the last mile connectivity for the metro. For example, in bus system, your last mile connectivity is walking. You just walk for 500 meters and you have a bus stop and you just take the bus. The question is, should we develop a world-class bus system? I have used BRTS in Bogota, in Turkey, and it is world-class. You feel pride of sitting in that BRT, same as we sit in the metro. So should we invest more in that? Should we invest, as you mentioned, that street? Because that is where you move. If you are taking a metro, a bus, a car, either you're cycling, walking, it is the street. And the focus is zero on that, For example, the activists who are opposing that cutting tree to build metro, for somehow I'm also agreeing, because you don't need to, destroy environment to build, transportation system in your city. And there are examples, where you are redeveloping a street without cutting even single tree, and you are catering to lack of people who are commuting in the street for their bread and butter every day. These are kind of infrastructure you need to develop. And we need to learn something from European cities, actually. And not from, sorry, Rashmi, and LA is the bad example for such kind of infrastructure development, and we in India really copy from it. LA is our god for any kind of infrastructure development. Either it is flyovers, underpasses, metro system, or any kind of parkings. You must see every 2 kilometers in LA, you must have seen this multi-storied parking that fascinate Indians. And we keep on developing this kind of infrastructure in India. But we need to focus on the right kind of infrastructure and where we are addressing the mass, where the people actually need it for their bread and butter, for their socio-economic development. And that is where the street in a right direction of development comes, where you need to focus on walking and cycling infrastructure, where you need to address on last mile connectivity and low cost transportation system. Low cost, because money matters. And we are, as a developing country, we need to really look into how we are spending our money, even each penny. So that really matters. And again, it is socio-economic plus environment. So many constructions, so many, of course, construction lead to economic development of our country, giving so many employability. It's a chicken and egg situation. So what kind of infrastructure Metro needs actually right now also with this existing system is to improve their last mile connectivity, which is far, far away from what we have right now. The only last mile connectivity right now is the paratransit. You need to take a auto rickshaw or share e-rickshaws and all that to take a metro station, or people like us easily take a car. Is it solving the purpose if you are looking into, socioeconomic development or environmental issue? Addressing environmental issues is a big question for me, actually. And the second thing you just talked about, thankfully, Ministry of Housing and Urban Development stopped that building of metros in each city, and they finally sent circular to cities that you really need to submit a feasibility study before proposing any metro in new cities now. So I think we have been saved from all these white elephants. So frankly speaking, we really need to relook into all this kind of development as a country. We have a lot of experts in our country, and I think there should be collaboration and sitting together and brainstorm about the kind of infrastructure we need in our city. For example, even in Gurgaon, you see the rapid metro. Who is using it? It's a big example of failure, even if it is a suburb of Delhi. Nobody is using it as a connecting to Delhi metro also. Because it's, again, you built a metro station in the above, and you built a 16-lane road in below the metro station. And there is not a meter of walking space which you can walk to the metro station in this rapid metro. Even in whole yellow line, you see, there is no walking space to metro station. People cannot cross this road to use the metro. So how can you expect people to use? And again, the fare, the price to use metro is not anyone can afford. People cannot spend 100 rupees every day to use metro if you are earning 50 rupees a day. So it's a big gap actually, and need to relook to the whole thing.
Thank you, Sarika. Himanshu, she's given you the opening, and you sort of I read your piece in the special issue, marked special issue on infrastructure as space, and you sort of make this point about how infrastructure is fetish and it's infrastructure for the sake of building infrastructure, and Sarika has sort of illustrated that well. But moving on from there, you also talk about the issue of the everyday social lives that infrastructure produces, and that's something that Kalpana already talked about from the gender perspective. Rashmi's talked about in the book. But if we think about it from the perspective of being urban designers or planners or people who are sort of planning for the city, should we be doing more to imagine what these socialities would be when we're actually imagining and planning an infrastructure project? Is that even possible to do? Are participative methods that we know of today going to lead us to that space, or is that also a utopia?
Great question, Mukta. And of course, you kept the most difficult one for the last. Thank you. This is the old Delhi-Mumbai rivalry playing out. Okay, but before I address that, I must congratulate Rashmi for a delicious book. I've read only half of it, so I think it'll only get better by the time I read the whole thing. And I've come to really care a lot about almost the absent acknowledgement of or interest in the complex lived experience landscape of infrastructure, and not just one, every kind. And we have little bits on everything from water to, but we really don't, that's not a big area. And so it's great to see that. So so that it's really difficult to answer your question, Mukta, because on the one hand, I guess one part of me is really depressed. I really have, looking at, and particularly living in Mumbai, what I have seen in like a short 20-year burst is a paradigm which I find fascinating, as much as it is scary. And it is the only thing the only way I have thought is appropriate to call that the infrastructure paradigm in Mumbai is of an infrastructure soup. It's like the alphabet soup that you look down in your perhaps in your bowl. Here we look up and we have the flyover, and we have the skywalk, and we have the monorail, and now we have the metro, and it's completely arbitrary. And that's the interesting part. So the complaint that Sarika had, I think all of those are absolutely valid. But what is fascinating is where this comes from. And I think I was just, I really loved the little vignette about the spontaneous urbanism in Metronama, which Kalpana also mentioned. And it struck me that, yeah, of course, I mean, as Rashmi notes there, that it's not exactly spontaneous. These things have been talked about. The metro has been in the discourse for decades, and even in Mumbai since the 70s. But it is spontaneous in a certain sense because of the way in which the decisions get taken. We had, and for instance, we had these any number of skywalks, basically, aspirational name for a foot over bridge, right? But really made to look jazzy and world class and all that, which were built across the city. And that was just one officer's initiative and power. Same officer goes and builds, literally goes and builds the monorail. Perhaps the first time someone has tried doing that in a big city, a technology that has only worked within airports. So it's done, and now it's we have acknowledged that it's a failure, but it's there. So what we are seeing is this collage is a very nice and kind word for it. Right? We are seeing that kind of chaos. So and what is driving it is also clear in many ways, at least so the good news is that we are not the only ones, I think, suffering with unnecessary infrastructure or overhyped infrastructure. We've got Flipbergs has done great work showing how infrastructure projects, mega infrastructure projects, have been systematically, have had their benefits systematically overestimated, and cost systematically underestimated across the most developed countries. So we have somewhere to hide, okay? But we of course don't have the deep enough pockets to really bear those costs. So given this context, where actually all I think that we are reduced to doing, and this is where I am kind of laying bare my hopelessness, and of course I'll try and pivot and start thinking a little more hopefully. In this context, I think what the architect, urban designer, and perhaps even the the activist is reduced to doing is celebrating the utterly meaningless little space given to you to improve the street, improve the space under the flyover. There's a new thing that's taking off in Mumbai. Is the most ridiculous of spaces, right? And yet that is where that's all that is left. So we are, and I come from, so I'm going to speak of Mumbai, but I think I'm speaking of Mumbai, but I know that Delhi, in that sense, you have this diversity, and that's where there is an opportunity in places like Delhi, where your roads are much wider. You have civilized sort of service lanes and all that, at least in the plan. Here we have service roads, which of course half the time never get built. In that context, I think there is perhaps more space, even post facto, because here what I'm seeing in Mumbai is really a post facto space now. Everything is done, right? All the sky is taken everywhere. All the major arterial roads, we have going to have metro now. No sky. Okay. Now, what can we do? And the ground is kind of, So I think on the one hand, the train has left in Mumbai, but there are other cities where I think that, as Sarika mentioned, there is hopefully, overall there is an awareness that we've pushed the metro idea too hard, and I think it was clearly pushed by the central government. It wasn't as if people were just desperate to build metros everywhere. Right? So perhaps I think we have space, much more, I think, space in the smaller cities, in the cities that have not had this, the high cost infrastructure like elevated metro, or now, of course, Maharashtra was flirting with the Hyperloop again, another untested technology for Mumbai, Pune. So I think where those kind of technologies have not yet gone in, I think there is an enormous, in fact, there's enormous scope to start with looking at the transport paradigm as a whole, the way Sarika pointed out, the way it is like perfect common sense right now, even in the sustainable transport debates, I think. And then the way BRTS was invented in Kuruchiba out of necessity, right? Out of the pressure of not having the money to build a metro, for instance, and also not wanting to destroy a heritage old core, you invent incrementally, not in one big shot. You invent something that becomes a system, and which is now a kind of solution, that is portable. So I think there's enormous scope to really be inventive, and that's where I think the problem, of course, is that transport is, of course, our hoary, I think, discipline and department siloization. So as professionals, transport planners have not yet begun to speak to urban designers, and even as departments, there is no hope in the state. And perhaps those kind of conversations, which are actually emerging from civil society, and Pune is a great case for that. I think those conversations, if we are able to start and structure, we will perhaps be moving towards a more empirically sound set of solutions, which will probably be differentiated if they come out of the realities on the ground. And we perhaps would find, and if we were to really shockingly take on, say, a kind of spatial justice agenda on board, and also therefore a mobility justice agenda, then we can begin to imagine the entire transport network completely differently. Footpaths would be at the center of our vision, given that 30 to 50% of people walk to work in our cities, right? And I think so there is scope to reimagine the paradigm, starting from not fantasies the way we start right now, because those fantasies are tied to big projects and all of those possibilities. But they are also, those fantasies, I think, are also why the state resorts to them, perhaps is equally because there isn't enough of this thinking that is happening within the state, I'm sure, but also in other places, about how to practically address this. So we perhaps need these spaces where urban designers, architects, planners, transport planners, land use planners really work together along with social scientists. That's where I think understandings of the metro through a book like Metronama can be very, very useful and very important, actually. Yeah, I'm done.
Thanks, Himanshu. I think, amongst all of us, we've brought up, very different sort of come from very different perspectives to this. So I'd like to hand it back to Rashmi. Rashmi, you've had people come at the book and the themes of the book from very specific positions. I was curious whether during the long research that you did and during the process of writing and in the afterlife of the book itself, did you have policy governance kind of thoughts that of your own that may not have found? I mean, the book is not the kind of book that gives prescriptive that's not the kind of content it's trying to lay. So if you have those thoughts, this is I mean, this is a good panel to throw it out, because the CPR's entire pivot for everything is taking it and then somehow trying to take policy lessons out of it. So yeah.
Yeah, so while I was doing this project, really from almost the beginning, all of the points, nearly all of the points that were brought up in the panel, and especially Sarika's points about the roads, about last mile connectivity, I mean, these were the backdrop, these were the issues. And in my introduction, I start the book by saying, less than, I think it's 5% of trips in Delhi are on the metro. And that's really why, for me, this project was about what I called earlier the transport landscape. The metro itself, as we know, it's mega infrastructure. It's powered by foreign investment from Japan. It is top down from central government, which is also why it had the oomph to get it made, and all of that. It is standalone. It was an engineering project. And really, once it was built, then people started making all of the connections themselves, right? Because you had to in order to be able to use it. And so that's why in my book, I write about auto rickshaws, e-rickshaws, cycle rickshaws, walking, biking, all of these forms. The love of this, neoliberal love of the car, and the car replacing the refrigerator and the scooter as the new mark of middle classness, which is a real problem for not only Delhi, but all cities. And in terms of the interviews I did with planners and architects and different folks who are in the driver's seat in some way, what they showed me was, and this goes to Himanshu's point, there is very little interagency cooperation. There is, part of it is, okay, the lag of bureaucracy, that is still there, even though I met a lot of younger people, who were coming into government, who wanted to work in government, who had a lot of ideas. They were able to do certain things. They were able to even change work culture a little bit. But, at the end of the day, it was very hard to make these connections. And so often they ended up bouncing between agency and agency, when in fact, ideally, they should be able to build their ideas through connections with different agencies. I think that's how this kind of change happens and how different imaginations of the city happen. I mean, the problem with the metro and early on, was, okay, Delhi's having a metro. I was looking at that, but then I saw, oh, Chennai, oh, Lucknow, oh, Cochin, all these cities. And, the cost of the metro, having it, I think Sridharan had said any city over 3 million in India should have a metro. And I thought, oh gosh, having one line as a vanity project with 6 stations does not a metro make. It is such an investment. And, Sarika is right. It takes away, it does take away. And this is why I talk about the BRT and why I went to those BRT meetings, because to me, thinking about the BRT is essential to thinking about the metro, right? And thinking about where money goes, how our urban imagination is realized, and whose imagination is it? Is it the bureaucrats? Is it the diplomats who are doing negotiations with the Japanese about these loans? How do we have a more people-oriented metro? The metro, of course, or sorry, not metro, people-oriented transport landscape. You know, the metro, of course, ironically, is considered, you know, for the people, almost a gift to the people, right? But ultimately, it's not that. Even if, and this goes to, I think, Kalpana's points about, you know, the contradictions and gray areas. Even if it is a lifeline for many, even if it does increase mobility for large swaths of the middle and lower middle classes, and even some parts of the working classes, and for many women, you know, not all by any measure. So it, you know, these gray areas are there, and yet there are these very practical considerations about, you know, how do you join forces with academics who study these things, and from different aspects, right? From the engineers to the sociologists to the environmentalists. And to go to Rohit's point, I mean, the sociality that you have in these other forms of transport, you know, those also are spaces where we can learn from, right? And where agencies should be learning from, right? It can't, I mean, of course, part of this is the technocratic state, right? And that's being stuffed down everyone's throat. So how do we make these spaces? How do we reimagine the actual agencies that decide things at the end of the day?
Thanks, Rashmi. It also sort of illustrates what Rohit was trying to say. Oftentimes these things are presented in an either or it's this and this is the alternative, or if you didn't have it, then something would happen or something would not happen. So it's also about how these arguments are constructed in the public discourse, you know, and we're in a situation where no matter how many numbers we can produce, and Sarika was rattling them off from the top of her head, most transportation planners who work, who are passionate about inclusive transport can speak for hours about with evidence, but the evidence does not seem to matter. And the evidence seems to, you know, you can basically pick up the evidence that's needed to tell the story you want to tell, and the story that we want to tell, and that's the sort of thing that I was talking about, or trying to provoke Rohit with, which he diplomatically avoided. But the thing that even those who are marginalized or who are less powerful and who are actually suffering the consequences of perpetual construction of budgets being spent somewhere else instead of being spent on something that would help them, even those people buy into these narratives. And of course, this is an example of a much larger political sort of situation that we have in India right now. So how does Curitiba happen? How do these bottom-up experimentations or these need-based experimentations? I mean, for me, in the Indian planning or in the Indian urban space also, there are other examples in which there are need-based innovations that have happened, where multiple actors have come together to do things. But when it comes to very high-end, you know, where investments, high investments are needed, when it speaks to the brand of a city, like the whole metro thing is about Delhi being a capital city, and it sort of needing the sort of big infrastructure, jazzy infrastructure to scream its to establish its status. Then the story is told from that vantage point, and then all other arguments fall by the wayside. So to me, it's really about our responsibility of retelling the story in a way. Rashmi, of course, Metronama does that by complexifying a problem in a way that maybe leads people to think about other ways of looking at it. But there's a lot more to be done in this space. So thoughts on that? Sarika's hand was up first, and then Rohit.
Yeah, so two things actually. Even in Metronama, when Rashmi mentioned that, most of the ridership are coming from Yamuna, other side of the Yamuna. It is just because, how to build metro, they have relocated this whole community to that side, and they don't have job there. And they are, bound to, use that metro. And unfortunately, right now, of course, I think in next year or so, the bus system coming there, and even the Delhi government studied that, there is a demand of huge for the bus system in Delhi. So that is coming, but right now the only source of traveling is metro. So that's why that is the, the most important catchment area for the metro system. Second thing, why is very important. It for me, it is a pride rather than, catering to a transportation system to the city. We all feel proud of metro, including me. I know, oh, it's so clean. Oh, see, there is less crime than in a bus system, or, all this kind of thing, that arguments that we face. And somehow we also uh, uh, come into that trap of, feeling pride of metro system. So it is, I think, more of pride than, addressing the actual issue of commuting for the mass. This is how we really, actually, we really to relook into the whole thing. As you mentioned, Mukta, and even mentioned in the book that, if you are looking why a transportation system is important, as we said, it is a backbone of the city. This is how a city grows, and this is how people from other cities or villages come to, such kind of cities for their livelihood. This is a source of livelihood, right? So then, if it is a source of livelihood, then are we addressing that? When we are saying that, 80% of our people, I think I'm not an economic expert, for it's a big question that is it economically viable for developing such kind of system in a developing country like us? So it's a big question for me, and then thinking about security and safety. Still, we can say that even the bus stops are really unsafe. Kalpana has done an intensive study about, Delhi's bus stops and all that. But still, you need to just walk 200-meter or 500-meter for a bus stop. Sometimes you have that big group of people walking to the same destination or coming from the same part of the area, and then bunch of people go there. But that is also, again, a big gap in a metro system. So I think it is not that we cannot interconnect. We have metro, how to interlink it with the bus system, the paratransit system, and how to improve the walking and cycling so that we can optimally use it. That is my last, I think, say for this whole thing.
Thanks, Sarika. Rohit, I think you wanted to jump in on the previous point, perhaps.
Sure. Actually, I wanted to talk about a couple of things. Once again, sort of going back to the 1990s, I think we have to think about or think like we are there. And this is more like CPR talk in a sense. So in terms of money, this is not a moment when we are thinking about money the way we are thinking about it right now in terms of infrastructures. JICA has just sort of stepped in. They are happy to advance as much loan as is required. Japan I mean, if you want to bring in David Harvey, we can here. Japan is struggling with its own massive overaccumulation issues, looking to put money into infrastructure around the world. Money is not really a concern back then. Secondly, there is also a discourse in the 1990s, not only and it cuts across many domains, which is this idea of leapfrogging, technology leapfrogging. The idea being that we are, to leverage the fact that India is so, supposedly lagging behind on so many dimensions. Let's leverage it to go with the most cutting edge, however defined, right? Most cutting edge technology. And that leads us to not to BRT, not to bus, that kind of thinking. Unfortunately, I mean, I understand objectively there's a different story, but thinking about it in terms of the public discourse, right? The cutting edge is defined or understood at that point in time as the metro, right? So when you have the situation where this kind of policy framework and where money, at least immediately, is not an issue, of course, it becomes an issue when we have to pay back the loans. And as you move to other cities where you're going to recoup even less than Delhi does, Metro does. It does become, and it is now a big issue, especially since our economy is in the doldrums. So, but if you think from there, we can understand where the Metro comes from. Of course, the question now is we have to have a sort of a fresh conversation, as a lot of the speakers here are talking about.
Himanshu, and then we'll go to Kalpana last.
Yeah, thanks. So I wanted to first address the question you asked, which is very important, Mukta. How do we get to a better conversation? And how did Kuruchiba do it? Well, Kuruchiba is not the best example for how to begin with, because the decision came through a group that was effectively installed by the military junta. But that's a separate, interesting kind of contradiction to think about. But what is relevant there is the fact that the decision was made at a city level. So I think the decentralization of transport governance is a very, very key aspect of this. Because all of these, I mean, look at the Metro. The Metro is a classic case of a particular infrastructure solution being pushed from Delhi into the entire policy sphere within the country. And as Rashmi also said, when I heard of the Kochi Metro, I just couldn't believe my ears. What contortions would have to be done to justify it even within the 3 million logic was something. So so I think the decentralization aspect is very important, which is, as we know, it is the exact opposite is happening. So that's the kind of reality of the way things will move, and one has to be conscious of. It's also, in fact, the Pune example, which we did some work on, is in this sense very interesting. Again, it is a bit of an outlier. No, BRT comes to India in Pune. It's not something at least I had not appreciated before we started working on it. And it comes shockingly because of the work ultimately of a civil society coalition, which has been pushing, which started by embracing trees that were about to be cut in the 80s, and then becomes more systemic in its approach towards sustainability, and realizes, boss, this is not, we need this BRTS, right? And they are the ones who create they do a lot of work, Parisar at the forefront, and many others, and they create the awareness. They even engineer events. They pluck out Penaloza when he comes to Agra, and have him talk to the leadership in Pune. So all of these things bring BRTS, unfortunately, in a disastrous manner. It's a total failure because of other reasons of haste, etc., and political expediency. But what has persisted is that it has shown that it works. In the worst case, in the worst kind of execution, it has improved things for a substantial number of people. And that civil society action has actually then created a new paradigm, which I don't think we have seen that now it's growing everywhere, of a new way of thinking about streets. And that itself has had to widen its vision because of involving cutting across different kinds of CSOs, and to bring in more, I think, vendor friendly, Street Vending Act 2014 friendly design into thinking of street design, etc. So I think we have those examples, very small, thin straws, but they are something to clutch at and build some kind of nest of possibilities, really.
No, you make a great point, Himanshu. I mean, it's something we see glimmers of in multiple cities, I think, in India. But the sphere of action of the civil society, how much it can expand, and whether it can reach the right political leadership is, I think, the question that we really need to ask, because there's a lot of action, but it can sort of repeat itself ad nauseum without getting the right ears, and then patting itself on its back and then landing up in other kinds of trouble. Kalpana, you're actually in the thick of much civil society action yourself on various agendas, so please chime in.
No, thanks. I mean, I think it's fascinating to hear all the perspectives. And, I think when we talk about not just civil society, but when we talk about what we're saying here is the citizen or the user or the person who needs to move around the city. And I think what we've been working on, and many of us around here, is who is that person, and when it certainly has not been women. As many of you spoke about, it's not the working class either in some cases, but the working class still, yes, in some cases, because they're seen as workers. The entire transport infrastructure globally has been designed to transport the worker, right? And in that transporting of the worker, the woman has been erased because of the way that women work. And so there's enough research today which is talking about how women move around the city differently, how women move differently, the nature of women's interaction with the transport infrastructure itself is so different. So the idea of the rush hour is a particular idea. It is based on the idea that there is an able-bodied heterosexual man who carries his lunchbox to work every morning, goes to work, and comes back in the evening. Now, this is built on the backbone of so many presumptions that, so there's able-bodied, there's heterosexual, it's all of it, it's not just patriarchy we're talking about here. So the moment you begin to invert some of this, and in some senses, COVID has thrown so many of these issues to relief, because I think for the first time, especially in a country like India, many men recognize what it is to work, to be at home and work, because women have always done it. They've been at home and worked in so many different spheres. And I'm saying specifically India, because I think especially the even lower middle class, the Indian man does not do housework, and still does not, maybe present company accepted, maybe a few, this thing, I think the discourse, and I think therefore, unless we bring in the issue of the work of care into the public domain, this is always going to be a one-dimensional conversation. It's like, the feminist revolution is not just women being able to go out and work, but it's really that the work of care begins to determine policy. The work of care is never going to go away. People are going to grow old, people will have disabilities, and children will be born. And pets. So whatever it is, the work of care doesn't go. And even today, even when we talk about the marginalized, even when we talk about the vulnerable, we're talking about the excluded populations, nobody is willing to talk about the work of care. Not in policy, on transport policy and housing policy, in the master plan. So I think, to me, that's still the point at which everyone stops. We're willing to talk about some things, but no, let's not go all that way, because that becomes too messy, too chaotic, So, while there is a whole lot of work about, women loitering, it's not just about going to work, it's not just about going to school, but also the right to loiter. I think that the more radical issue is to say, what about the work of care? That is never going to go away. And unless policy, every single policy on infrastructure also looks at that, we're not truly going to have any transformational change in our policy, urban planning, urban policy, urban design, transport planning, whatever. So that's my pet peeve and pet passion always.
Thanks, Kalpana. And I think it's a point that is getting, like you said, because of COVID, a lot more reverberation than it's done before, and we hope that momentum doesn't die. Rashmi, last word, and then I'll sort of wrap up, because it's nice to keep it tight, and then people can come back and comment on the Facebook feed and on our website and stuff like that.
I'll just say that I think Kalpana's point is extremely important. My book focuses on outside spaces, on public spaces. And one of the things that I had been interested about to study in the metro was that it was a new set of public spaces, literally strewn out across, so many kilometers of urban space in the city and beyond the city. But, you know, this question of care, this question of how home life and responsibilities link to our outside world and public spaces is really, I think, the root of it, right? And I think that when we talk about the transport hierarchy, which of course is reflective also of different, you know, social hierarchies in the city and social inequalities, that not only have to do with gender and class and caste, but also, you know, able-bodiedness and sexuality and all these different registers that we're so much more now aware of and which are so vital for understanding, to go back to that original point about, you know, the urban imagination. These things do, I don't know if they start in the home, but they are linked to the home. And I really see the home also as a site of where these conversations and imaginations have to come out of. And I totally agree with Kalpana. I mean, you know, especially when we're talking, you know, about questions of gender, and, you know, there's so many domestic workers, for instance, who came to the metro, who do ride the metro now. And this connection between the home and the outside is one that is fluid, you know, and this idea of, you know, gendered responsibilities and how they move through the city. And I love this idea of, you know, that women, for instance, move, their mobility actually is different, not just their requirements, but their actual physical mobility as they move through the city is different. And I think this conversation, you know, has been around the metro, but actually, you know, going by everyone's comments, it has so much more to do with, you know, or as much to do with different forms of transports and actually different spaces within the city, whether public or private, inside or outside, and how they connect. So I want to actually thank everyone for such a rich conversation in that way, and really sort of starting with the book, but then really going out and thinking about the larger questions and really what's at stake for the average person as they try to navigate the city, as they try to, you know, negotiate their own mobility.
Thank you, Rashmi, and definitely the book was a good provocator for all of that. So I'm glad we had that as the base for this conversation. I'd like to also thank Rolly Books for sending out books to those of us who did not have it. And I'm sure if Chirag had been able to attend, he would have given us a little bit more insight into the making of the book, which could have also been interesting. Thank you for the patient audience. Some of you who've been putting out comments and feedback on the chat, and I'm really sorry that we don't have a more interactive format today, but it just seemed better to do it in this webinar format, which I personally find really like impersonal and strange. But I know that all of you are listening, and thank you very much for doing that. And last but not the least, thank you so much to all the panelists who not only readily agreed, but brought so much thoughtfulness and so much passion into this conversation. And it's my privilege to not only have you as panelists today, but also have you as friends, colleagues, fellow urbanists who are always ready to jump on a new thought and on a new avenue of discussion and enrich it. So thank you very much on behalf of CPR and myself for this evening.
Thank you for the discussion. Actually,
Thank you.
really, we are discussing after a decade about metro.
Thank you, Rashmi. Thank you, Mukta.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Rashmi.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
See you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye bye.